My very special guest this afternoon is Grahame MSP, and Christine's going to tell us a little bit about herself and hopefully educate us a little bit in the area of politics as well. You've been a politician for a while.
Well, I got elected 15 years ago, but before that I was a court solicitor, and before that I was a secondary teacher.
And if we go right back to the beginning, I was intrigued to find out that you were born in England, not Scotland.
Yes, I was born in Burton-on-Trent. My father, during the early days of the Second World War, travelled down to that part of the country for training. There he was in his Glengarry with his tartan trews, and he saw this lovely English rose singing at a piano. She had a beautiful voice, and he says, I'm going to marry that woman. She had no chance, not with my swaggering father. So they married and came back up to Scotland, but my mother wanted her first child to be born in her home country, so I was born in England.
So what were your early years like growing up in Scotland?
Well, like many people, they didn't have their own place to start with. We stayed with my Granny Grahame, Easter Road in Edinburgh, in a front room where another child was born, Tony, named after my mother's brother, who had died very young. She had quite a hard life, my mother. She'd been orphaned at 10, very tough life. And then we got allocated one of those lovely prefabs that were built after the war. And there we lived for many years. Then we moved to a new council house then in the 1950s in Edinburgh, where we family grew to 5 children. My father always said he wanted a football team, but I think my mother was very grateful he stopped at 5.
How was life? Being English, I've always loved coming to Scotland and living in Scotland, and I have a slightly idealised view of Scotland. I get to live in the countryside and everything like that. But how was it actually growing up? Was it a pleasant experience?
I had a wonderful childhood because I had great parents. And my mum was then a stay-at-home mum, like many women were then. And she was always there. If you skint your knee and you ran home, Mum was there with a plaster and a kiss. If you covered yourself in tarmac, which I once did, she took me home. She sat me on what we used to call the bunker, which is the kitchen counter, and she scrubbed me with lard until my knees were red. I think it was punishment, but she told me it was to take the tar off. But anyway, a very happy childhood. Not wealthy, not by any means. We never had a car. I remember when we celebrated the very first fitted carpet that we ever got, and Dad used to save money, and he handed his pay over to my mum, and he got some money of his own, but they saved money. And I remember when they came home with the first radiogram, that'll tell you how old, and then every week he'd come back with a record in brown paper, which we would put on ceremoniously and play. But, and, you know, he was very much the head of the family, but in a nice way. We were a very good team. Was it a political household? Were the seeds of your later political career sown there? No, it was a debating household. I'd say, you know, I'm a socialist, probably because of everything, you know, the way I was brought up. And, you know, the fact that my education was due to the state, my health is due to the state. I had very bad appendicitis at 17, you know, and I got through that. So, but what they did was they debated all the time, and great newspaper reading family. We'd get lots of papers on a Sunday, which my father insisted on reading first. He used to sit in the garden shed and read them all, and then allocate the papers to us. And heaven forfend, if you read the paper before him, you'd almost ironed it so you didn't know you'd been at it. But we used to debate. And I soon learned that if you could contribute to an argument, you got to stay up past your bedtime. So, you know, I'd be sitting there at 9 o'clock at night, I should have been in my bed at 8 o'clock, and I'd be saying something, and my mother would say, she's not in her bed yet. My father said, she just made a very good point. So that's how I learned to debate. It was actually to stay out of my bed. So actually, at the risk of being slightly flippant, you became an MSP to have a leisure going to bedtime. No, I quite like an early night now, but it's funny how things happen. But they were always a family with a social conscience. Uh-huh. I mean, I remember my mother in the prefab. There was a lady next door. Her husband was a bus driver. I seem to remember that. I was just a child at the time. And she said that woman can't afford curtains. The woman couldn't afford to put curtains up. So my mother gave her a pair of curtains to hang up to give them privacy. That was the kind of thing that reminds you, you know, of, if you like, she was a great socialist, my mother, in action rather than in words.
Now, we'll come back to politics a little bit later on, and we'll get to politics a little bit later on, probably. But you've got a couple of other passions. Wildlife, I think, is one.
Yes, I've you could say my two cats are wildlife, but I chair the Parliament's cross-party group in animal welfare. I would say animal welfare is, at the heart. If it's anything I could have been other than all the other things I've done, it would be a vet.
Mm-hmm.
I have huge affection and regard for animals. I think we've come a long way from understanding that animals are sentient beings, that they see the world with their eyes, not our eyes. So yes, I have two cats because my lifestyle doesn't permit a dog. I was joking with you before we came on air that I've just bought a whole bag of bird seed as well, but I keep the two apart. But I feed the birds, and I get beef dripping and make them up special treats and everything. So I have a huge number of birds come to my garden. The cats are so old now anyway, they just sit and look at them and can't be bothered to do anything. So
I think I read somewhere you're into gardening as well.
I love gardening. I have quite a small garden. I once had a very, very big garden with the fruit cages and veggie patches and shrubs, and I had a huge polytunnel with corn in it. Kind of miss that. Maybe have to look for some place for an allotment because my garden's quite small. I've dug up all the grass. You can't walk anywhere without there being a plant. And where there isn't a plant in the ground, it's in a pot. So all my bulbs practically are in pots. They're all coming out. And then when they're finished, I move them out of the way and I put other things in amongst. Because I find gardening a therapy. And it's your own wee world. It's your own wee world.
Does your life as an MSP allow you enough time to do those types of things?
Well, Sunday, I pretty well try to make, apart from this Sunday, I try to make Sunday a day when I have time for, I've got in Edinburgh, at least in Livingston, I've got one of my sons and his wife and a granddaughter. I haven't got time to get down to London to see the other son, who's getting married in the autumn. But, so I like to see them. And so Sunday, is also the day when I do most of my housework. So somebody once said to me, you'll be taking Sunday off, God didn't work on Sunday. I says, but he didn't have to hoover. I have to hoover and get the washing done. So it's my domestic day, but also try to see the family.
Now, I asked you to pick a couple of tracks. One that you've chosen, which we'll play next, is Girls with Guitars. Is there any specific reason why you chose that?
Well, I suppose it's odd, because of all the things I've done, you'd think I'd be a woman's libber, but I think I'm a woman's libber in action rather than in saying things. And Girls with Guitars is about stereotyping women into certain careers, and this girl goes off and does her own wild thing, and I'm all for that.
I think possibly we can tell your life story from there. Najad, Girls with Guitars. The choice of my guest this afternoon, Christine Grahame MSP. I think it'd be kind of fun if MSPs and so on, when they walked into the Parliament building, they had a theme tune, and I suspect
that's mine.
That would be yours.
Or Blues May Choose.
Yeah, we're coming to that in a few minutes' time. But can we turn to politics a little bit? And a lot of my political guests recently, we've asked them to explain some of the different functions that different political offices fulfill. And because I suspect that, like me, we have a general idea, but we don't know exactly. Now, for example, we've kind of been into the local council area here, so we know about that on this show. But we have MSPs, we have MPs, and we have MEPs. Can you explain what they are and what the difference is, just very simply?
Well, MEPs, members of the European Parliament, attend the European Parliament, deal with European legislation and the budget of Europe. MPs from Scotland deal with what we call reserved issues like defence, income tax, benefits, overseas investment, immigration, things like that.
Is a reserved issue one that's sort of for the whole country rather than specifically Scotland?
Reserve means, in terms of Scotland, it's matters that the Westminster Parliament does, not the Scottish Parliament. Right. The Scottish Parliament deals with what you might call the domestic matters. It deals with housing, it deals with transport, it deals with justice, policing, it deals with education, it deals with, that's the ice cream van, it deals with, you've quite thrown me, it deals with environment, but it doesn't deal with energy, which is a bit of a contrast. So there's a whole range of what we might call the domestic issues that are dealt with by the Scottish Parliament. In fact, I have chaired in committees in the Parliament. I've chaired health and sport, and justice. So in 4 sessions of the Parliament, in each of these sessions, I've chaired a committee.
What's the relationship between, how is the relationship between Westminster and the Scottish Parliament?
Well, the Westminster's got nothing to do with our health service or our policing or our law courts or our housing apart from the budget. I mean, the money they give us is what we work with, but they have absolutely nothing to do with the decisions that we take.
But if you step outside politics for a second, there is obviously presumably some overlap, and probably there's certain things that come from Westminster that, you know, possibly everyone or certain parties don't agree with. Is it an acrimonious relationship or a friendly relationship?
It's not very good just now, of course, because of the referendum coming up.
Right.
It's got very polarised. And obviously it depends who or what's in government at Westminster. After all, we've got a Tory Liberal government at Westminster. There's only one Tory MP in the whole of Scotland. There's hardly a marriage made in heaven with the Scottish Parliament. And the Scottish Parliament generally is much more left of centre. Most parties in Scotland are to the left of where the same parties are in England. But I'll give you an example. For instance, the bedroom tax, which was imposed by Ian Duncan Smith, the so-called spare room tax. Now that's been imposed in Scotland. We can't not have it because it's Westminster reserved. But what we've done in Scotland, and this is supported by the other parties, is we've put money into a pot to help people so they don't have to move their house and they can pay it, because it's actually just wrong. I mean, the bedroom tax was probably introduced because of the London area and the pressure on houses. But if you live in Midlothian and you live in, say, Pennycook, and they're asking you to move from a 2-bedroom to a 1-bedroom, where are you going to go? And you want to stay in Pennycook, there aren't houses. So the idea that it was fair is just nonsense. And also, a house is a home. It's not 4 walls. People belong there. It's their home. It's their community. So we've had to mitigate against that. So there's something that came from Westminster that we didn't want. And we'd get rid of it in an independent Scotland. We wouldn't have any bedroom tax.
And what do the MEPs do?
Well, the MEPs deal with things like, there are huge things like European Rural Development Funding. I'll give you an example. Auchendinny has got a lovely community hall now. Quite a lot of that was paid at a thing called European Rural Development Funding. Now, that came from Europe to the Scottish Parliament and then was allocated, some of it, to Auchendinny. So there is funding that comes from Europe, separately from Westminster.
And is it like an even balance? I mean, do the Scottish Nationalists, are they the main participants in all those 3 areas, or is there a balance?
No, but we have an what happened with the Scottish Parliament when it was set up on proportional representation? It was so that no party could have an overall majority over all the other parties. Well, quite unexpectedly, and believe you me, I didn't think it would happen, when the election happened in 2011, the SNP had a majority over all the other parties in the Parliament. So we are the major party in Scotland, in the Scottish Parliament. We're not the major party. Labour is in Westminster. And it's even Stevens pretty well at Europe, because I think I'll get this right, there's 2 Liberals, there's 2 Liberal MEPs, there's 2 SNP MEPs, there's 2 Labour MEPs, and I think there's 1 Tory. So pretty well even Stevens at Europe.
Now, switching the subject slightly, you serve on the Justice Committee.
I chair it.
And what does that entail?
Oh, it's a huge, busy committee. We deal with policing. So when Police Scotland was set up, we dealt with all that legislation, and we had a lot of witnesses in, and we interrogate witnesses and ask them questions. So if any of your listeners are interested, you can log on to the Parliament's website and see the kind of stuff we do. We're now looking at a big row about corroboration. Should there be corroboration in Scots law or not? That's a huge debate. We have other debates that come forward. So anything that's on the justice portfolio or human rights comes to my committee.
What's your position on the can't even say the word corroboration?
Corroboration. Well, I'm fed up saying it. The jury's out for me. I've made my position plain, which is distinct from my party. That's partly because I'm a lawyer, but it's mostly because I've heard the evidence in front of my committee. I mean, we had 5 weeks of evidence from panels. I mean, what people forget is the Scottish Parliament isn't First Minister's question time with an argy-bargy. That's not what it is. Most of the Parliament is committee work, and it's not boring committees, it's serious committees looking, in my case, at things like policing, and at justice issues. And the Health Committee, it was looking at how you get health and social care to work together. So there are big issues dealt with in committee, and one tends to find, not always, but one tends to find that people aren't so party political in the committees.
That's one thing I was going to ask you about, because to be honest, I haven't seen a lot of footage of the Scottish Parliament. You do see it in Westminster, where people seem to appear to be totally strange in their behaviour, and I just wonder sometimes if the parties were, certainly down there, I can't speak about Scotland to be honest, because I haven't actually observed it, but certainly in Westminster you see this kind of free-for-all, and you know, sort of wonder, well, if I was running a business, would I want those guys running the business?
It's because the television companies are showing what makes dramatic television.
Uh-huh.
A lot of it isn't dramatic. A lot of it, I mean, my committee sits this Tuesday from 10 o'clock till 1 o'clock. Sits every Tuesday. I also chair what we call a subcommittee on policing, because when Police Scotland was set up, we set up this other committee that meets at the moment once a fortnight to ask detailed questions, focused questions about policing in Scotland, the costs, what's happening. Now, all that is public. All that can be seen on the reports. Anybody can come in to most committees. Sometimes there's wee things we do in private, but not much. They can come in and sit in the public area and listen to a committee, and that's the real workhorse of the Scottish Parliament, the committees.
Can I go back to the word I can't say, can you say it for me?
Corroboration.
Can't say it this afternoon. Corroboration. Could you explain for our listeners exactly what that's about?
It's not 2 eyewitnesses. That's the first thing. It's not that. It's not 2 eyewitnesses to something. Say, for instance, David, you said you'd been attacked by someone. The first thing to do is identify the person. And secondly is to demonstrate you've been attacked. There's been a crime. Now, if you were just to be on your own, you could be mischievous and name somebody and say they came and hit me over the head with a spade or a shovel or whatever. Mm-hmm. So there has to be something else to demonstrate it. For instance, it could be injury to you, which would demonstrate with the nature of the injury that it must have been done by somebody else and not self-inflicted. And then you've got to have something to help you say who the person was. And it doesn't have to be somebody else who saw it, because many crimes take place behind closed doors or in private. But something like DNA, something that links the person, let's say, to the item that hit you, to show that it was in their hands, that there had been previous behaviour towards you, threatening, that kind of thing, all builds a case to say, yes, there was a crime, and yes, that person, we think, did it. But then, of course, it's got to be proved in court.
But I can't see how you could possibly not have some sort of corroboration with the whole thing.
Well, it depends. There is a debate that corroboration is a very technical term. And it's so technical, I really honestly don't want to send people into a daze this afternoon. It's very technical. But what they're trying to say is that you have something other than that technical thing. You have all sufficiency of evidence to show it. Now, myself, I don't know the difference between it. And it will be for far greater legal brains than myself. I stopped law 15 years ago to look at other ways. So what the government has done, it's set up a very specialist panel headed by a man called Lord Bonamy, QC, retired Court of Session judge, with a huge team to look at, if we get rid of this thing called corroboration, then what other safeguards can we have? For 2 reasons. To make sure the victim has a fair chance in court, but secondly, that people are not wrongfully, found guilty.
Are you familiar with the differences between English law and Scottish law?
Some of it. I'm not a practitioner, but in English law, the jury system's different. In majority, it's juries. In Scotland, it's just, a simple majority, not a percentage of a majority. England apparently doesn't have corroboration, but then England's had a lot of problems recently with some prosecutions, that cases that have fallen. Other than that, frankly, I don't, because Scots law over centuries has developed its own path.
Okay. Well, to lighter matters, blue suede shoes. What was your choice? Why was that your choice?
I have to say, I have a pair of blue suede boots. I haven't worn them yet because I'm frightened to get them dirty, but I'm going to wear them at some point once the weather's a bit better. But I think Elvis is just wonderful. And when I'm driving my car, I have to say, I play Elvis quite a lot.
Elvis, blue suede shoes. Now, if you need me to tell you that, where have you been for the last 50 years? Now, my guest after 4:30 this afternoon is Sergeant Michelle Lindsay of the Pennycook Police Force. We're going to do a regular, probably monthly slot, and she's going to update us on local issues, local matters, and should be very interesting. So if you're interested in the local policing here, stay tuned about 4:30, and we'll have a very interesting talk. Now, it'd be impossible to talk to you without discussing independence and the referendum and all matters there. Could you outline for us the main points? Why should, obviously from your point of view as a Scottish nationalist, you want independence? Mm-hmm. What are the main reasons for?
Well, I have to say I've been one for 40 years, so, you know.
You haven't just jumped the bandwagon.
I haven't, no. And I was Labour before that, and I still remain a socialist. And the thing about independence is that, and even within the Scottish National Party, there's a range of really left of centre people like me, people more middle of the road. And independence, first thing, isn't about the Scottish National Party, it's about independence from Scotland. And I think I start from a very simple notion of what a nation is. I see Scotland as a nation. So I say to myself, what should a nation be responsible for? It should be responsible for democracy for its people having democracy, and social justice, letting them, you know, and a fair distribution of wealth. That would be a good government within a nation. But it would also mean that you would be able to control whether or not you went into a war, whether or not you had nuclear weapons, what kind of aid you gave to other countries, what your role in the world was. Now, at the moment, Scotland is not sitting in Europe as an independent country at the European Parliament, nor in the Commission. It's not the United Nations. I think most people in Scotland don't want nuclear weapons. I think many people in Scotland didn't want to go into Iraq in a war, but we had no option.
Probably quite a few in England as well, though.
Yes, but we see, it's not an England versus Scotland thing. You heard my background. To me, if I deal with Scotland first, from the premise that a nation should have certain powers and responsibilities, then that's to me what independence is about. We would get the government we vote for. We did not vote for a Conservative government. We've got one Conservative MP. At one point we had none. You know, so we're getting governments we don't vote for. Now, some people say, yeah, but your vote's important to change the government at Westminster. It's only done it twice in the last 60 years. So Scotland tends not to get what it votes for in terms of Westminster. We would definitely get it one way or the other if we were independent. I mean, the point is, if you vote in September, yes, you don't have a change of government then. You will have a change of government 15 months, 18 months later with a general election when all the parties will compete for your votes. And that, to me, is proper the way it should be. As for England, I see a great opportunity for England with Scotland's independence, particularly the north of England, parts that it tends to be London-centric. We know that London sucks a lot of the wealth and a lot of the energy from the UK. It has high prices that perhaps have led to our bedroom tax and high rents and so on. So I see Scotland's independence being an opportunity for places like the northeast of England to have their own regional assembly, which they had an opportunity to many years ago when they walked away from it, and for England to become more devolved within its own nation state, so that London would no longer dominate the rest of England. I really mean that. I think that it'd be so refreshing for England, for Scotland to be independent, to see what it can do with its parts, its parts of England that, frankly, are having a pretty rotten time as well.
Are we not, though, as a world, moving more towards more bigger and bigger units of government, the European Union and so on?
Well, first of all, we've had Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, all these countries that and unfortunately at the moment Ukraine with its difficulties, becoming separate states in their own right and getting on with it. But when you're an independent nation, it doesn't mean that you've got nothing to do with anybody else. You have to build relationships, but they're by consent. So an independent Scotland would deal with Europe from a Scottish point of view. We deal with the rest of the UK from a Scottish point of view. We deal with United Nations from a Scottish point of view. But it doesn't mean we'd always get our own way, but you would negotiate. But it would be what Scotland wanted. And what we've had over the years is not really what Scotland has voted for.
Am I right in saying that basically it's a cultural issue at the end of the day? Is that a fair way of summing it up?
No, it's to do with social justice as well. It's to do with democracy, frankly. Basically, there is a cultural difference, but that's grand. I mean, I just love Welsh choirs, by the way. It's just so it's not a divisive thing to have cultural differences, but the democratic deficit for Scotland, to use that term, means that we've not got the kind of things happening in Scotland that I think many people in Scotland want. Now, you can't do it by a halfway house. You can't do it by more devolution, because you're going to hit things that will still remain with the Westminster government. For example, energy. Energy is with Westminster. The whole policy of energy is what we've got. The environment. Energy, of course, means the oil and the gas. So they keep the oil and the gas. We get to keep Trident. I don't think that's a good deal.
Is there anything, I don't want to get too serious, it's Sunday afternoon, but
no.
Is there anything...
You did ask me a question.
is there anything that there's a downside to in devolution, in independence?
Downside in it? I mean, I wouldn't see one, because I'm optimistic for Scotland. I think the Scots are perfectly capable of running their own affairs. I mean, for 15 years, we've run all our domestic services, and we've done better things, frankly, than has happened south of the border. We have free prescriptions, because it was wrong that people were picking and choosing what to get out of 5 that the GP might say they had to get. They might say, which ones can I not have to buy? So we don't do that. It's about £8 for each prescription in England. I mean, that's the first thing. Free personal care, we say to elderly people, when you've got to get help dressing and so on, you shouldn't be charged for it if you're having it done at home, because you wouldn't be charged for it in a hospital. We say to our students, you shouldn't be paying tuition fees. So we've made socially justice choices, and our National Health Service remains public. Whereas in England, it's moving to privatisation. So over these 15 years, and I've been in Parliament 15 years, I've seen Scotland marching in its own direction to a more socially just society. I'm sure there are people in England who would wish to replicate that. That's why I think independence for Scotland means liberation and, a different way of England being run as well.
Now, I suspect that a big part of the decision for people when they vote is simply the question. It's not the only issue.
No.
The big question is going to be, will they be better off financially or worse off financially?
Well, they're not going to be worse off. That's for a fact, because we do know there's billions of cuts coming from Westminster. Now, we have to remember the banking collapse and the mismanagement of finances by London has caused such a difficulty in economics for the UK that we will have. This is not the end of the cuts to benefits and so on. There's more to come. Both parties have told us. Scotland has the resources to do something completely different. I'm not just talking about the oil and gas. We're a great food and drink exporter. We're a great exporter of academic knowledge, of research, of green power. We have so many assets that we can do. So, to me, the answer, will you be worse off? No. Will you be better off? Yes. But not, I hope, greedily. I want you to be better off, to have a better off society, so that the hospitals are good for the man and woman next door, even if you never visit it. so that we have a decent policing, even if you never have anybody breaking into your house. That's a good society. And I think Scotland would be moving in that direction.
Very interesting. When I studied economics, which was a long time ago in England, and took my O-levels in it, they teach you about something called economies of scale and diseconomies of scale, meaning when things get bigger, there's certain savings, and when things are smaller, there are certain savings, and there's a certain point which I don't think is ever optimum, where they kind of meet. Are there any diseconomies of scale by becoming smaller?
No, I mean, I think you just have to look over the North Sea to Norway. In the 1970s, along with Scotland, Norway discovered North Sea oil and gas. Norway has great social services, high earning. It has high tax, but it's high earning, so, it evens out. They have what they call their pension fund, which is worth billions of pounds, which they've saved from the oil and gas revenues, and they are one of the biggest investors now in the world with the money that they have. So you just need to look over to 5 million people who were in the same position as us 40 years ago, and what happened there and what's happened to Scotland, where we've got food banks and people having the bedroom tax. That tells you Scotland's perfectly capable with the same population and actually more resources than Norway to more than look after its people.
We'll talk more with Christine Grahame after this. That's Gypsies, Tramps and Thieves. You're listening to Crystal FM. It's the F4 show. I'm David Summer. My special guest this afternoon, and I think you'll agree it's been really eye-opening, is Christine Grahame MSP. Just to kind of wrap up, Christine, I thought we'd ask you some fun questions. Favourite TV shows?
Well, I have to say, I like things that I can just sit down and let them wash over me. So I like Poirot, and they're all in the same genre: Miss Marple, Columbo, Morse, Frost. So I love all these detective things. Oh, and also Murder, She Wrote. Quite like that as well. And then you can tell I'm addicted. I know them all. And then I also like Star Trek, but I like the first version, and I like the second one, The Next Generation, with Jean-Luc Picard. I think I've seen them so often I can actually see some of the dialogue.
So I'm guessing detectives would be the whodunit.
Detectives, yes.
And the Star Trek would be Let's Go and Fix It.
Yes,
No?
yes.
That's my go at being an amateur psychologist. But, what about influences? Who's been the inspirational people in your life? I know you're going to say your mother and father, but besides them...
Well, but that's not as easy. They really were.
Yeah.
I mean, my father was quite an extraordinary man in that, I'm no spring chicken. I won't disclose my age, but I'm not a spring chicken. I remember when I was at school, it was the rule that you left school at 15 if you were a girl, you were engaged at 18, you were married at 20, and you had your first child at 22. I actually did get engaged at 17. Because that was the path in the housing scheme where I lived, but I then decided to go to university, and that ended that relationship, and ended up marrying later. But he always said, and I was the first in the street to go to university, let alone girl, because you just didn't think people from our place got to university. That was for posh people, we thought. So my father had always said, it doesn't matter if you're a boy or a girl, you're entitled to make these things of your life and, take the opportunities. So he really was full of foresight about it.
Yeah, he was ahead of his time for that time.
Absolutely. And with 4 daughters and a son, he said, you're all going to be equal. And so that's why I suppose when Women's Lib came along, I didn't really understand it because I'd always had these attitudes. And I've always been in careers where men were. I mean, secondary teaching was basically men when I went in. The law, mostly men when I went in, and politics, mostly men. And I didn't choose that because there was men, but I didn't see why I shouldn't.
How did you find that, pioneering that whole aspect of life? In a way, you're pioneering for other people to come after you, but how did you find it being one of the first people going in there?
You mean to university?
No, as a lady, yeah.
Well, no, I think working class going to university was the toughest because my accent was funny. I had a real broad Edinburgh accent. I wasn't well off. I wasn't well dressed. I probably felt more than I ought to have felt, but I felt that people knew I was from a very working class background, and I had a real inferiority complex, which made me speak even more broadly Scottish, and take things on and become, I just went at it. But I think I went back to university in my 30s to do a law degree, and by that time it didn't matter. I was, much more confident, although obviously I was a professional by then, but I don't think I'd have been the same. But I think it's been working class that was harder than anything else then, is to feel that you were entitled to be there.
So, outside of the family, who were your influences and inspirations?
Somebody called Winnie Ewing, who was a member of the European Parliament, MP, and then was an MSP, who was an extraordinary woman, also actually a lawyer, but she was a great influence on me. And I think people like everybody we mentioned, like Nelson Mandela, people like that, who Mahatma Gandhi, people who rose above the mediocre in politics, such humanitarians, with such forgiveness and quality, and depth, and actually men that didn't say an awful lot. They weren't full of words, but the words they did speak, my goodness, they were powerful.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for coming this afternoon. It's been really informative, and I know you have a busy life, and to take a little bit of Sunday to come in and talk to us here in Pennycook is very, very much appreciated. My guest was Christine Grahame MSP.